Luce, and this is Art History 497X, and we are just moving forward with the May 8th lesson, and so hopefully you've now figured out how to center your creature, and you've set that creature up in a setup and void loop, or sorry, setup and draw loop. And I just wanted to go a little bit further and talk about that error that we produced in that last one, just to be super clear about what it is, what the difference. Some of you may have gotten this intuitively already, but there's a nice little exercise in the book that allows you to really get a hang of what the difference is between that setup and the draw loop. And so the niceness about the exercise in the book is how very simple it is. So we're just going to go ahead and work through that. And so our first step is to get our setup basically started. And so we're going to do those things that are kind of normal to do in a setup. And the first command we would like to see is size. And because we're just doing something very simple, we can actually kind of let it be with that one. And then the next thing we want to do is set up our draw loop. Now remember, you've got setup and you've got draw as your keywords. Those are the functions you're calling. But because this is processing and not JavaScript, you do want to preface that with this little notation telling the computer this thing, this function that I'm about to give you isn't going to return anything. It's an action-based function, and so I'm voiding the return. That's basically what that's telling you, right? So hopefully that will help you remember to do those voids. And again, if you're getting errors that say things like it looks like you're doing active and static drawing simultaneously, you've probably forgotten that void aspect. Either that or you may have set a certain number of commands without doing the setup feature. So you've got a certain number of things and then you've called draw, but you've got commands that lie outside that loop. So you need to do the setup in order to do that. So that's, if you're getting those errors, that's probably one of those two things. Okay, so in this case, we're going to, just like we did before, we're going to throw a background command and we're going to make that background just white, so that's not very difficult. And then we're just going to draw a rectangle. Oh, you'll have to excuse a phone ringing. It's going to make some noise, but we'll just let that be in the background. So I'm just following along with the code that the book has so that you could do that as well. And it's saying that as part of this draw, we're going to do a few commands. We're going to call our stroke color black, which is 0. We're going to make a fill, which is a shade of gray at 175. We now know that's a shade of gray. Don't forget your semicolons like I was just doing. And then we want to call a rectangle. And then we're going to do that rectangle in center mode. And now we're going to do something that's really interesting, and this is where we're going to start to use the commands that we're going to be using with our creature next. So we're going to call rectangle, and we're doing center mode. So remember, the way we call a rectangle in center mode is we're going to declare the center of the rectangle, and then we're going to give it a width and a height. But instead of figuring out exactly what center we want, we're going to use mouse X. Whoops, and remember, things like capitalization matter. So in order to get that to actually be a set variable within processing, we need to use a capitalization. So mouse and then capital X, and then mouse and then capital Y. And so those are just parameters that are universal parameters. It's like a set of vocab that you eventually learn with processing. And so you're saying, what value should X be? We want X to be wherever the X for the mouse is. And we want what value for Y? We want it to be whatever value the mouse is for Y. And that's how we're going to do that. And then we can just sort of have whatever width we want. So let's give it a 50 and a 50 because we've got, well, actually let's make it a little bit smaller than that. Let's do 20. Okay, and that should be everything we need. So we're just going to close that out. And so basically, if we're going to read this, like it's a language, so we're going to start out with doing a setup, and that setup is going to be to set the size of the paper at 200 by 200. That's going to then end the setup loop. We could put a lot more into that setup loop if we wanted to. We did that with the previous example with our creature, but in this case we're just setting the size, and then we're going to start a draw loop, and that loop is going to be infinite. It's not going to run just once, it's going to be infinite. And so the first thing in that draw loop we're going to do is create a background, and then we're going to make a rectangle that has a stroke that's black, that has a fill that's gray, and that rectangle is going to be drawn in center mode, and it's going to be tied to where our mouse is. Okay, so let's see how this goes. And what did I do wrong there? And again, wonderful to see the error message is very, very normal. I think all I've done here is accidentally put a space. Let's try that again. No, it's not liking that. It's thinking that it's an integer. Only we know that that's not an integer. That should be telling it it's the mode. But you know what? My rec mode isn't coming up here, so I've typed that wrong somehow, so I'm just going to retype it. And now it's turned blue. So whatever, I'm not sure. I couldn't see what was wrong with it before, but I retyped it. And now you can see what it's doing. So where my mouse is where it's tracking. Yeah, so that's pretty cool, right? Now, what if we wanted a different result? Well, we have all sorts of parameters we can play with. Let's say we want our rectangle to be bigger. Well, let's make it 40 by 40. That'll make it twice as big. Now you have a bigger rectangle. Now, it's really interesting, don't you think, that we're just getting one rectangle. When I told you before that this gets played once and this gets looped over and over and over again. So if that's being looped over and over again, technically we should be seeing tons and tons of squares, but we're not. And if you've read the book, you probably already know the answer to this, but I want you to think, why is it that we're only seeing one square? Okay, hopefully you have the answer in your head, and now the second part of that question is, how can I change it so that I see many, many squares? Right. Hopefully what you did was you identified, just like we were doing before, the difference between placing something in the setup versus placing something in the draw command. So by putting background 255 in the draw command, what we're saying is, when you loop this program, the first thing I want you to do is create within the entire paper a whiteness. And then I want you to draw a rectangle. So what you're really seeing is at about 30 frames per second, 30 times a second, it's redrawing this. And the first step that it does is basically make everything white. So it erases the square that was there a second ago and redraws the square that's with my mouse. So that's pretty cool. And just to show you how different things can be, if I just cut, copy, paste that line out of the draw, and instead put it in our void setup, you're going to see a very different result. And so there, now you can see the 30 rectangles a second coming onto the screen. And if I move really slowly, you can see that you basically almost get a black tail. And if I move fast, you can see those squares start to separate. Yeah? So that is the power between having one aspect of your program that runs just once and then a loop. And so really you're seeing kind of the interaction between loops and more static parts of your program. So, and being in control of that, and how just that little difference in control creates very different results. This is where you're starting to understand conceptually how the organization of a program can really change the results, and how it gives you power to work within the aesthetics, right? So these are all the kinds of games that you see architects starting to play as well. How can I move and change these variables? How can I break up programs and understand them in different ways that allow me to really activate sort of certain powers in the building, right? So maybe the loop you want to do has something to do with the sensor, and that sensor is sensing the people in the building, and it's opening windows or shutting windows or something like that, right? And you don't want those windows to be draining, if it's an energy saving device, you don't want those windows to be adjusting real time necessarily. You want them to be sampling and looking for sort of differences, a certain level of difference from one moment to the next that would then trigger, oh, this building needs to cool down with this many people, and now I'm going to open, right? So there you have to introduce different logics into it, and that's similar to, those kinds of controls are similar to what it would mean to move a background command from what runs once versus something that's being run 30 times a second. Right? Okay, so that's part 2, and hopefully that clarifies what the difference between void setup and void draw are. And now we're going to go back to our creature and work at making it mouse interactive just the way our square is. So hopefully you can see that that's going to be a pretty easy step now that our whole drawing is relational. Okay, thanks so much.